The Director General of the BBC has written to all BBC staff warning them not to be anti-Semitic, and they say that we Jews don't understand irony. This shows absolutely no self-awareness. I can't for the life of me understand how the head of the BBC could write this sort of letter without realising the massive contribution the BBC itself has made to that atmosphere of anti-Semitism that's not just swept through his organisation, but also the whole country. When the BBC, day after day, pumps out a twisted misrepresentation of the war going on in Israel at the moment, it's hardly any surprise that anti-Semitism is on the increase, both inside and outside the corporation. The BBC has such an enormously trusted position in not just Britain's mind, but the whole world over. People trust it as an honest, independent broker of news, which is why it's so bad that it gets everything so wrong when it covers Israel. The BBC isn't just another workplace, it isn't just another broadcaster, it is the nation's voice in many respects. And it's not just opinion, it's actual provable facts. Think back to when Jeremy Bowen reported that the Al Ahli hospital in Gaza had been bombed by Israel and, in his words, flattened. He later recorded a programme for the BBC in which he admitted that he didn't know that for sure, and in fact, he'd got it wrong, as anyone could have seen who was following the story from the word go. It didn't look like an Israeli strike, it did look like a misfired rocket, and that's exactly what it was.
No, I don't regret one thing in my reporting.
But you said that building had been flattened.
Oh yeah, well I got that wrong. I don't feel particularly bad about that.
But the damage was already done, because no sooner did the BBC and other outlets report that Israel had flattened a hospital, and there were protests all over the Middle East, people taking to the streets in anti-Israel rage, and that in turn had a knock-on effect on actual world events when meetings were cancelled for Joe Biden when he was visiting the region. And it predates the war. I remember appearing on the BBC's programme Dateline London talking about COVID vaccinations. Israel had actually been doing very well at vaccinating its population. But what did the BBC have to say about that? They blamed Israel for not vaccinating Palestinians.
But the Oslo Accords are very clear that in a crisis, healthcare is ultimately the responsibility of the Israeli government.
It isn't the responsibility of the Israeli government under the Oslo Accords to look after the health needs of the Palestinians. They have their own health organisations and health ministry. In fact, they didn't ask for those vaccines.
It turned out later they had to agree that they were wrong. They've often got things wrong. Even their reporting not that long ago of a bus of school children who'd been abused on Oxford Street when trying to celebrate Hanukkah, that was twisted in all sorts of ways that implied that those children themselves had engaged in racism, until the Jewish community created a massive uproar and eventually the BBC modified their reporting. Then there was the time that the BBC broadcast on their news programme that the Israeli army had actually targeted medical teams and Arabic speakers in a hospital in Gaza, when the direct opposite was true. They had sent in teams who were able to deal with doctors and speak Arabic in order to try to protect civilians and to preserve the ability of the hospital to carry on doing what it's meant to do, helping the sick.
An apology from the BBC. We said that medical teams and Arab speakers were being targeted. This was incorrect. We should have said IDF forces included medical teams and Arabic speakers for this operation.
Yes, they were forced to apologise, but that hardly undoes the damage. And once might be an accident, but when it's a mistake you make over and over again, you need to question why it keeps happening. The BBC ran another apology for a story in which Hamas accused the Israeli army of carrying out summary executions in the Gaza Strip. They later said, buried away on some apologies page, that this was a Hamas statement and they hadn't made sufficient effort to seek corroborating evidence to justify reporting the Hamas claim. The broader problem is that by constantly misrepresenting news about Israel and constantly taking a negative or critical view when one isn't appropriate, they obviously create a spirit of anti-Semitism and negative feelings towards the Jewish state. The current war is a good example because the BBC focus intensely on everything they think Israel may be doing wrong and very little on the actual strategies of the war and the individual twists and turns of both sides. If you follow what's going on in Israel's war in the Israeli media, you see a completely different story. Now, the BBC could easily incorporate some of that into their own coverage. I'm not suggesting they do it unthinkingly, and I'm not suggesting that they cover it exactly as an Israeli outlet would. But there's so much more information than what the BBC provides, and that would definitely influence people's opinions on what's going on there, possibly in a way that would mean they're much less critical, and as a result, far less anti-Semitic. With constantly negative and twisted coverage like the BBC's, it's no surprise that there are massive protests against Israel on the streets of London, which have made many Jewish people, if not most, scared to go into the centre of London while they're going on. Tim Davie is right. There is an anti-Semitism problem within the BBC. There was the staff member recently who'd been posting online talking about the Holocaust as a holohoax, who'd branded Jewish people an invader colonizer species. It's unthinkable that someone like that could have a job pretty much anywhere and maintain it. For weeks, the BBC refused to refer to Hamas, the terrorist organization that invaded Israel, killed, raped, and kidnapped innocent civilians from their homes, as terrorists. It shouldn't have been difficult for them. Britain and many countries around the world classify Hamas as a terrorist organization, but not the BBC, apparently. And back in October, 6 reporters and a freelance journalist who worked for BBC Arabic, their Arabic language news service, were said to have shared comments that compared the Hamas terrorist group to freedom fighters, and all of those journalists were taken off air while the BBC investigated them. That's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to BBC Arabic, which has a long history of having to make corrections, often quietly and almost invisibly. And then there's The Apprentice, their entertainment show starring Sir Alan Sugar, a Jew. But they had a contestant in this series who shared such offensive views online that really they shouldn't have broadcast the series, even if they didn't realise he had those views while they were filming it. He called Zionism a satanic cult, and he also boasted about having made a list of sadistic doctors, as he called them, who were supporting the Zionist genocide. Instead of actually pulling the series or re-editing it to remove him, the BBC sent him on some sort of retraining scheme so that he knew how not to be offensive in the future. A bit late, seeing as the series was already completed. And anyway, it didn't seem to have much effect. The BBC should have cut their losses and pulled the series. How awful to broadcast a series in which you have somebody with those views and you know about it just because you've put a lot of money into producing the series already and don't want to remove it. When he says that many may be aware that the BBC has been alerted to some anti-Semitic behaviour by people who worked with us, it makes you wonder what planet he's living on. We've been alerting the BBC to anti-Semitic behaviour and twisted misrepresentations of what's going on in Israel for years, for decades even. He talks about it like it's some sort of new problem that's cropped up in the HR department. I know people who have and still do work for the BBC who've shared with me their fears that they could even say something internally about anti-Semitism that goes on there. If that's the case, just think how bad it must be. More than ever, people in the Jewish community are afraid to go out and live their lives visibly in the UK, and that really is a massive tragedy. I can't emphasize enough just how much of a problem that is, not just for us Jews, but for everyone. Because when you live in a society, when there's such a pronounced racism that's making a group feel that way, you have to listen to what they're saying. You can't just accuse them of misunderstanding their own circumstances, or worse, twisting victimhood so that they can somehow change your opinion on something going on in the Middle East. Jewish people are not manipulators who are trying to change your mind about what's going on in Israel by claiming to be victims here in the UK. It's just not comprehensible that an entire ethnic and religious group would come together to do that. Instead, it's time to listen to what Jewish people are saying, as we've been encouraged to do for every other ethnic and religious minority group in the country. And many, many Jewish people feel genuinely that the BBC is not just full of anti-Semitic or twisted anti-Israel opinions that have a negative effect on our lives, but also that they deny it when it's pointed out to them and drag their heels when people even try to help them fix the problem. I'd like to think that this would be the start of the BBC trying to sort out this problem really, truthfully, honestly, once and for all. Well, I'm afraid it's going to take a bit more than a leaked email from Tim Davie to make me and plenty of other Jewish people think that that's about to happen.